The finances of the country's state-owned enterprises remain weak, with many on the brink of financial collapse. In October's medium-term budget statement, the South African Post Office was allocated a 2.9 billion rand government bailout. The ANC's manifesto suggests National Treasury should look into prescribed assets. The idea would be to force pension funds to invest in struggling state-owned enterprises. Now, South African Post Office CEO Mark Barnes, who is here, believes this could be a solution to the SOE funding crunch. Mark, do you think that this issue would even arise if SOEs were in fact doing well?
No, I don't. No, I don't. It's rescue capital. You know, it's a question of when you've got an institution, a financial body that is in trouble, the price of rescuing it keeps on going up as the risk goes up. And at some point in time, you get into the sort of death spiral where there is no amount of capital at the right price that would rescue it. Because if we were to try and raise capital to sink into one of the failing SOEs, the price for that capital would be self-fulfilling in ruining it even further. So at some point in time, you then need to have state capital if there is a virtue in pursuing those SOEs' existence. And you must remember that SOEs don't have a purely maximize shareholders' funds mandate. They have a socio-economic mandate, and part of that is provision of services to the citizens of South Africa. So at some point, you have to consider the alternatives. And as you opened this discussion, it was only in these kinds of circumstances where if you look at the alternative, does prescribed assets even come into focus as an alternative cost to the country? And you have to look at it as a whole. What is the overall cost compared to the alternatives?
But obviously you can't throw money at problems. Should we not insist first that they be properly run, and once we see a turnaround there, and perhaps only then, should we then talk about what we're talking about today?
Well, the extent of debt that we're carrying in SOEs now, it is not possible for them to earn their way out of it. And so the alternatives, take for example the alternative that Eskom is talking about, 15% increases for 3 years in a row, which is like a 50% increase over 3 years. Well, consider the impact of that. So that would maybe help them trade out of their debt of 420 billion or whatever it is. But that would have such an impact on gold mines and manufacturing companies and so on. So the same pension funds who are investing money in gold mines listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange would have those assets depreciate by far more than the yield that they are enjoying on a government underwritten prescribed asset. That's the first point. The second point is the alternative is no one will lend them the money because it's not worth the risk. So the government steps in, National Treasury steps in, and it issues a guarantee which the banks then lend against. Okay? In essence, that is underwriting the banks, not underwriting the state-owned entity, because the banks are taking no risk, and that's at a huge cost to the economy and the depositors of the banks, who get a very small return on their cash.
Now, I mean, in your interview with Bruce Whitfield the other day, you said, and I quote, "The money has got to come from where the money is made. You have some choices to make. Are we going to increase taxes?" Now, isn't that a bit of blackmail? Because, I mean, you and I know that a lot of tax-paying South Africans believe that they are being overtaxed already, and that in the main is because there is a small pool, you know, of people who can actually contribute by way of taxes.
It's that same small pool whose pension fund assets are in debate here, okay? And so, you know, it's not a question of blackmail, it's a question of the reality check that we need to go through to say, what are the alternatives? Now, people say, privatize, sell it, you know. Well, you know, we sold all of the airplanes in SAA, and look where that got us. We became a price taker forever. People speak to me in the post office all the time about selling our buildings. We've got a very good land and building portfolio. In every town in South Africa, we've got a presence. That is our core differentiating asset. We should never sell it. We should be creating state assets, not continuing state dependencies. And if we were to tax generally, I think that's a bad idea, because then all you're doing is passing the burden of the electricity users onto the general tax base, which is a small tax base, which is the same tax base that are defending their walls and saying, don't give us prescribed assets. So there's only such a big pool of assets, and it only comes from so many sources. You have to decide which is the better of the unpleasant choices that we're facing ourselves.
But how much of what you believe around this issue is as a direct result of your interactions with other state entities as you were fighting, of course, to get the post office to get into the whole SASSA grants?
This particular debate is not informed by my interactions with other SOEs, which is limited. It is informed about how we finance ourselves at the post office, where we borrow money from established commercial banks underwritten by National Treasury. Well, we're not borrowing much anymore, but we used to. And yet, we would argue, why don't we issue post office bonds, for example, that have got a yield of 8% instead of the deposit rate for retail, which is 3% or something like that, and let the citizens of South Africa benefit from that funding underwritten by National Treasury rather than the established banks. I mean, the National Treasury guarantees are essentially underwriting continued economic inequality by underwriting established banks and not giving that yield to the citizens of South Africa via, sort of post office bonds, which you may recall, if you're as old as I am, used to be around in the olden days. So it's a debate about which is the most efficient way. And by the way, people say you're throwing good money after bad. I think if this debate were to prevail on prescribed assets, they'd enjoy an extraordinary amount of scrutiny. People go, okay, what are you doing with this money now? This time we don't want it down that same hole. Okay. And so I think the national interest would be served by raising specific capital assets into specific projects. Let's say we build another power station, for example. Why don't we prescribe that that a portion of the money you manage goes into that specific asset and all eyes on that asset? We can't get away from the potholes in the ground. You can't build a racetrack until you fill the holes.
But if you look at what is coming out of the PIC inquiry, for example, if you look at what happened at Steinhoff, you would think that people interrogate these things and take the right decisions, put the right pressures, play their oversight role. But as evidence coming out of those two examples alone suggests people don't do that.
Well, maybe it's time that we did, and maybe it's time that force that is brought about makes us do it. You can't, there's no pool of capital that can solve incompetence or corruption. Okay, if those two things are present, you can get whatever capital you like at whatever price, you won't solve the matter because the hole in the bottom of the bath is bigger than the hole in the taps that are filling it. Okay, it's as simple as that.
Which is what people are essentially... why many people are arguing against this idea.
Yeah, but you can argue against prescribed assets. I wish we didn't even have to have this debate. But what else? What's the alternative? Sell Eskom to an international player at an extraordinary cost. Build a nuclear power station financed by the Russians. What are the alternatives? You can't say, I'd like to have this and I should have that and we could do that. What can we realistically do at the lowest net cost and the highest probability of success? That's the truth that we're facing, not the ambitions of a fairy tale.
Mark Barnes, thanks very much for coming through.
Thank you. Thanks for your interest.
He's, of course, the Post Office's CEO.